Hello and welcome to the Crux of MedTech. We go beyond the buzzwords, bringing you the insights from the innovators, investors and leaders who are driving this life-saving space forward, because I'm absolutely fascinated by the stories that people have to tell in MedTech. As someone who works in this sector on a daily basis, I come across so many interesting people and so many interesting stories that I think the world deserves to know about. Welcome to the Crux of MedTech.
Hello, Hannah, and welcome to the Crux of MedTech podcast.
Hello, Henry. Great to be here.
Awesome. So the first thing I'd like to dive into is how you got into the neurotech space and what first pulled you to it. So yeah, let's dive in straight away with that. How did you get into neuro?
So my background has always been on the kind of science side of things. So as part of my undergraduate, I was studying physics at university, and I was kind of interested in what you could do with physics. Unlike some other subjects, there's not necessarily an obvious career path as to what you go into afterwards. So during my undergrad, I started kind of investigating through internships what are some things I can do with this background, with this experience from university. And one of the internships I did was at GE Healthcare. So this was a really fantastic experience. It was only a short internship, about 5 or 6 weeks, but they really allowed me to get some insight into some of the different areas that they are working in. So part of it was looking at MRI scans and different new upcoming methods that you can use there. So things like using hyperpolarized gases as a kind of extra contrast agent, so you can actually see inside the lungs. So normally with MRI, you're seeing water molecules, you're seeing tissue, so the lungs are kind of this black void. But they had a really cool method where you could use hyperpolarized gases. You take one breath, hold your breath for 10, 15 seconds, and get an image of the inside of the lung. And that's super helpful if you've got any kind of blockages, or for cases like COPD where you can't breathe very well, the alveoli are all kind of different shapes, and you can actually start to quantify those conditions and see what's going on. So I thought that was really cool. They have a bunch of different tracers that you can use for different kinds of medical imaging. So whether that's on the radioactive side, whether that's on the tracers like gadolinium that you can use for MRI, that was really cool. And I also kind of, almost like looking over someone's shoulder, seeing what's on their screens. I saw all these brain scans, and it was the first time that I realized that you can actually see Alzheimer's on an image. So you look at a picture of a healthy brain, even an older person's healthy brain, and you look at a picture of somebody with Alzheimer's, and the brains look really quite different. They kind of shrink in Alzheimer's disease, and you can see some of these things on imaging before the symptoms get really bad. So if you're looking at the images of people with bad symptoms, it's really obvious that there's a kind of physiological difference in that. And that wasn't something I realized beforehand. I kind of thought, this is something that people are struggling with their memory, they might have other symptoms. You think that that's maybe about some of the connections in the brain, or the way that the brain is being used. I hadn't realized until that point it was actually about a kind of a loss of brain material. And being able to kind of see that on a screen was quite powerful. And it made me realize just how much we are learning and advancing in this space. And how these kind of new methods are giving us new insights and new almost windows into what's going on. So that kind of started me down that journey, I think. And I then kind of found myself a supervisor as part of my master's project that was in medical imaging. It did end up being MRI actually, and that turned into a PhD as well. So that was kind of my route into it.
Okay, awesome. So let's talk about what the kind of work you do at the moment with TTP and the neurotech division here. So what's your role at TTP, and talk me through some of the things that you guys are working on?
Yeah, so I lead the neurotechnology team here at TTP. So we're a team that really specializes in helping companies develop the next generation of Neurotechnologies. So in a lot of cases, that's implanted medical devices that interface with any part of the nervous system. So that might be the next generation of brain implants. That might be the next generation of spinal cord implants for pain relief, for things like that. There are a lot of nerves in the body. The nervous system is a really big part of the body. So it's really about helping companies get new devices out into that space in order to have a really big impact on patients. It's an area I'm super passionate about. I'm really excited by what can be done in this neurotechnology space. I think it's a really fascinating alternative to pharmaceuticals. And yeah, at TTP, like I say, we're really here to help other companies on their journeys to develop new products and get them out on the market.
Sure. And it's interesting you mentioned the pharmaceutical side. So we obviously prepped for this, and you talked about how where pharmaceuticals haven't been able to deliver, there's the potential that neurotechnology can overcome some of those. So can you explain the idea behind why that is, and a little bit more about some of the things you've seen as part of that?
Yeah, so pharmaceuticals tap into the chemistry of the body. That's how I think of it. So the chemical system in the body, that includes things like lots of different pathways for connections, hormones, different kind of chemical messages. And we have had some fantastic drugs that have been developed over the last 100 years. There's a lot of fantastic advances there, but there's also limitations. So there are some diseases where either we haven't found good enough drugs or a wide enough range of drugs, or where the side effects are just really severe. So you can think of depression as one example I often come back to, or pain as well, pain relief, where yes, we have some solutions, and for some people they work really well. But there are also parts of those populations where either they stop working so well over time as your body becomes used to those interventions, or the side effects become too severe for people to want to keep taking the drugs, or they just don't work that well for some people. So I really see neurotechnologies as another part of that toolkit, another option that doctors should have available in order to give people an alternative option. And because neuromodulation taps into the nervous system, it's quite a different way of interacting with the body. And I think that difference is really valuable because it means that it has a different side effect profile. It's not like it has no side effects, but it has a different side effect profile. It will probably work better for different people, either in terms of efficacy or in terms of how it fits into a lifestyle. It's also not something that you have to necessarily remember to take every day as a pill or take 3 times a day as a pill, right? So if you take the example of spinal cord stimulation for pain relief, of course, there are plenty of pain relieving drugs out there, but as we've seen in recent years with the opioid epidemic and what's happened in the US there, it's challenging to get that really effective pain relief. There are challenging side effects and the addiction that can ensue. So spinal cord stimulation offers an alternative way of targeting the pain. So in spinal cord stimulation, you have an electrode placed into the spine alongside the spinal cord. And by applying regular pulses of stimulation, you're impacting those signals that go between the brain, where you're interpreting the pain, and the source of the pain, which is typically in the kind of lower part of the body if you're using spinal cord stimulation. And that disruption of those signals is really effective in some people for either completely eliminating that pain or significantly reducing that pain level. The side effects that you see, if you see any, is around paresthesia. So that's like a tingling pins and needles sensation, which some people don't feel at all. Some people have that, and it's fairly mild, and they're not too worried about it, and it's a kind of continuous background thing that they stop noticing after a while. And for some people, it's really annoying and really frustrating. And then you're kind of thinking about, okay, how do you get the right level of neuromodulation so that you get the efficacy that you want, but with minimum side effects? And there's been some some cool innovations over the last years in terms of new waveforms, new ways of applying that stimulation in order to minimize those side effects. So if you use very high frequency, for example, then that seems to significantly reduce the amount of paresthesia that is experienced. So yeah, it's an exciting space, and there's this kind of these constant new innovations that are coming through, which is super exciting to see.
Yeah, so neurotech has taken such a large growth in so many different areas over the last few years, and it seems like a lot of the industry, there's a lot of funding going into the industry as well. So what's kind of driving this? Is this like kind of research that's coming out? Is it like, is it new technologies that we've got access to that we didn't have access to before? What's kind of driving this real growth of the industry and all these new areas of neurotech?
Yeah, I think there's several reasons. I think the technological advancement is part of it. So new materials are being developed. So on the brain interface side, there's a lot of new materials which are thinner, more flexible. They can form better to either the surface of the brain or have less of a kind of disruptive impact to the brain when they're implanted. So that's where some of that innovation is coming from. There's also just advancements in things like battery technology. If you can have a smaller battery that holds more charge, holds that charge for longer, that allows you to miniaturize those implants, and that might allow you to place them in different parts of the body which you couldn't have done 15 years ago. So traditionally, the size of it's called an implantable pulse generator. It's kind of like the computer, the kind of the battery and the thinking of these devices. Typically is placed either just kind of close to your chest, just under your shoulder, where there's a bit of a space there, or if it's in the lower part of the body, it's kind of around your hip area. There are now some other companies that are starting to develop or have already developed devices that can actually sit like in your skull. So you're taking out a small part of the skull and you're kind of putting it in there, and it's actually kind of invisible under the hair. That's not a location you'd have had access to in the past. And in some cases, that's about actually taking the battery out of the device and using wireless power to power these things, particularly if the therapy is not something that needs to be always on. So maybe you're just trying to give yourself a daily dose of something, kind of like you would for a drug. Maybe it only needs to be used for a minute a day. You don't necessarily need an implanted battery for that. You can wear something on your head that powers that device. Or in some cases, there are actually batteries in there, and it's just that you're making use of that new technology in order to miniaturize the batteries. I think as well, another thing driving it is the research that's been going on, a lot of which has been happening in academia, some of which has been happening in industry, about better understanding how the brain and the nervous system works and how it's all connected. Because so much of the nervous system is actually about the connections between the different nerves and neurons rather than just what they're doing themselves. And as we understand more about some of those networks and which kind of how to tap into them, I think that is kind of paving the way for new therapies. And in some cases, those new therapies can be used with existing devices. So kind of widening the indications of devices that are already in use or with minimal changes to those devices. That's quite a nice, probably slightly faster route to accessing a new market. I say slightly faster because you still have to run very large clinical trials, and that's actually where quite a lot of the time and certainly a lot of the expense goes. So it's not by any means easy, but at least you can get into those trials a bit faster. And in some cases, it's really a new technology that is needed in order to do that. And again, we're seeing quite a lot of the innovation in this space starting at universities, being university spin-outs, turning into companies, and then those companies developing those new technologies.
Okay, so one of the things you mentioned there was about the understanding more about the relationship between the nerves and the neurons and how they interact. So what's the kind of current understanding in some of these areas? What are we learning, and what's kind of the latest research that's super interesting at the moment?
Yeah, so if we go back a bit in time to when we first started really understanding anything about the brain and how it impacts the body, how it controls the body, how it senses signals from the body. It was kind of a revelation that different parts of the brain seem to be linked with different parts of the body. So there's this thing called the homunculus, which is a really weird image if you Google it, where you've kind of got like different parts of the body superimposed upon the brain. And the point it's usually trying to make is that quite large parts of the motor cortex are given over to certain parts of the body, like your fingers, for example. You need very fine control and fine sensation in those parts of the body. So there's a lot of the brain is given over to that, whereas less of the brain is given over to your stomach or your back. Again, a fairly large amount is given over to parts of the face, particularly the lips, because again, for speaking, you need that kind of fine control. So in a similar way, you're kind of saying, okay, so this part is the motor cortex, that's about controlling different parts of the body. Here's the visual cortex, that's about interpreting data from the eyes that you're learning from the world around you. This part is about memory, and you kind of start chunking up the brain into, well, what's the purpose of this bit? What's the purpose of this bit? And then people started discovering network effects and the kind of connections between different parts of the brain, and the fact that actually with some injuries, a lot of things were discovered by accident through people having weird injuries, or through how the brain is impacted for epileptic seizures, or for surgery that you do because of something like epilepsy. And you say, actually, even if all these parts of the brain are there, if you sever some of the connections, then they don't work properly anymore. So clearly different parts of the brain need to be able to communicate with each other, need to be able to kind of fire together in order to work properly, in order to have this. So then there was a lot of research that went into this field of kind of the connectome. So how are the different parts of the brain connected together? And also discovering just how flexible it is. So there's a phrase used in brain research, which is plasticity. So how plastic is the brain? And what that means is essentially how can the brain adapt and change itself? And it can change itself. It changes loads in early childhood as you're learning, but it continues to change in adulthood. And there are some fun studies done where adults are learning new skills like juggling, and you do some brain scans before and afterwards, and you're doing MRI scans. It's not like the person is juggling in there, right? But even that looking at the physical aspects of the brain and the connection, the kind of connectivity between different parts of the brain, you see changes there over a course of weeks as somebody has learnt these new skills. So that was pretty fascinating. And more recently than that, I think some of the latest really, really interesting improvements in our understanding is around the resting state of the brain. So in MRI, you're often looking at changes compared to a baseline. So what happens when somebody is thinking about a certain thing compared to not thinking about it? What happens when somebody is tapping their fingers versus not tapping their fingers? And what people have more recently realized is that actually if you have somebody in that scanner doing nothing, kind of just daydreaming a little bit, but not thinking about anything in particular, that used to be considered kind of background activity. Sure, the brain is looking after the heart and making sure that you're breathing, but basically it's background level, not very much going on. But actually there's a huge amount of information and of constant communication, constant signaling that the brain is doing in that background state. And there's really interesting information that's held within that, and that we're just starting to kind of access. And looking at some of these different networks in the brain that are being used at rest, and how they are different in people with ADHD or people with depression, or people just in different physiological states, and what that might teach us about those conditions, what that might teach us about, how might we be able to tap into that potentially for diagnosis as well as for therapy, right?
I'm interrupting this episode to bring you a word from our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical technology development with deep scientific and engineering expertise.
They support ambitious medtech companies in solving high-risk, high-complexity challenges where there's no margin for error. Whether you're tackling uncharted technical territory or racing to bring a product to market, TTP provide clarity and direction. By de-risking innovation and ensuring seamless alignment with regulatory and manufacturing demands, TTP help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes.
And I think some of the bits you mentioned towards the end of there, and like ADHD, depression, all those kind of things, like there's a lot of research that we've got pharmaceuticals that actually do tackle those, but actually solving some of those challenges, like it does alter the kind of person. And I'm just going to kind of link it back to kind of a little bit of a personal experience more recently. So I'm pretty sure that I've got ADHD, and I know it's very trendy at the minute for a lot of people to say so, but starting to explore whether I have or not. But for me, I think that's also part of what kind of makes me able to do what I do, like with this business and things like that. But so that's kind of the scarcity of like, I don't really want to try and take away the things that make me good from that. So pharmaceuticals and thinking about how we would actually use those is very unattractive to me because I don't want to take the bad away. So do you think it can kind of solve some of the challenges that might be associated with like those taking the pharmaceuticals and like using brain signaling to try and overcome some of these more neurological conditions almost?
So what I think is really interesting about neurotechnology is that you can be more specific about where you're applying the therapy. So with pharmaceuticals, in general, you take a pill and that is going to be that's going to be putting something into your bloodstream, which is going to be going around your whole body, which is going to be impacting a certain type of cell or a certain type of signaling or a certain type of receptor, but wherever in the body that is. And it's particularly challenging to get across the blood-brain barrier. So if you're giving drugs that need to impact something in the brain, often you end up having to give quite high doses in order to get enough of it through the blood-brain barrier. And that then means you've got the higher doses, which means chances are you're going to have higher side effects as well. One of the interesting things with neuromodulation is that you can be much more targeted, much more specific about what you're doing there. Now, often that means that you have an implanted device, right? In order to get really, really close to the nerves or the neurons that you're targeting, in order to be really specific and just stimulate those that you want to without stimulating the others, that usually requires an implantable device, or at least a kind of implantable electrode. Not always. There's one of the kind of trends, one of the themes at the moment is about reducing the invasiveness of devices, including all the way to non-invasive. Now, I find this a very interesting kind of trade-off space, because you win something, you lose something. So by going completely non-invasive, you're making your treatments, your therapies much more accessible to a much wider population. You're reducing the risk profile of that, but you're probably also reducing the absolute efficacy, because you're probably not getting as much of that therapy into the nerves you're trying to get to. You're probably also stimulating more of the nerves around that area. And that might be a really good trade-off for some cases, and it might not be a good trade-off for other cases. So I think time will tell. I think it's a very, very interesting question, interesting space. To see how that develops in terms of that. Reducing the side effects. And I also, you have quite a lot of control in the neurotech devices about, even after the implantation, once you've got the kind of location set, like which of your electrodes are you stimulating, how much energy are you putting in, what's the waveform, what's that kind of shape of the energy that you're putting in, and you can change that over time, right? It's not like you have to do it once and then you can't change it, you can't do anything about it. So it might be possible to kind of decide yourself on a given day, do you want to turn this off? Do you want to turn this on? Do you want to turn this halfway on? And that might depend on how you're feeling in that day. If you're really high energy, then you might say, okay, cool, I'll leave that off. I want this. Or it might be that you go, okay, I want to temper this down a little bit. let's increase that therapy a little bit today. And that might be something that you can control yourself through your smartphone in the future, right? And that's not science fiction. That's something that you really might be able to do. I think the biggest question there is which how do you develop that therapy in the first place? What is this device? Where does it go? How do you know where to put it? How do you know that you're doing more good than harm?
Well, it's crazy that we're working towards that, like the controlling different mood and emotion via a smartphone. Like there's obviously probably incredible benefits to it as well, but then you've got to think about how safe it is. What about cybersecurity? What about being able to control? And like I don't know. Let's dive into some of this topic. So there's a lot of policy coming up around brain and BCIs and being able to control things. So let's dive into those kinds of topics. So like we obviously have the state of where we're at right now. Like what are companies or what is the space thinking about in terms of policy, regulation, cybersecurity, and all of those meaty topics?
Yeah, so I think that the topics of cybersecurity is definitely top of mind. It's a really important part of any device, anything that has that connectivity. Of course, you need to be sure that you can connect to a device, but only you and your doctor can connect to that device, that you can do that securely, and that there's no risk of other people tampering with the settings or locking you out of it, or it's just a must-have in the industry now. I would say that in this whole cybersecurity, also moving into ethics, this kind of wider topic. I think the ethics of neurotechnology, there's been a lot of discussions, actually, like quite a lot of engagement recently on that topic, and that really is a bit of a spectrum. On the one hand, for any medical device, there's always a bit of consideration around ethics, particularly around what are the clinical benefits versus the potential harm. That's a very normal thing for medical devices companies to be thinking about, and have been for decades for all sorts of different devices. That's not new in any way. I think the bit that grabs the headlines in neurotech is obviously around, you're reading signals from the brain. Does that mean that this company now has access to your inner thoughts? And you're kind of looking ahead into the potential future in decades' time, and what information do you want companies to have about you? I think it's very easy to hype that up from a media perspective. I don't think we're close to really needing to worry about that level of detail at the moment. Now, that's not to say that it's not an important topic to discuss, because actually I think you want to be having those discussions before the technology gets there, because I think what would be quite dangerous is for one company to get there first before you've got kind of regulations on this in place, and actually whether it's a real issue or whether it's a perceived issue. I think you can cause a lot of damage to the company and the industry by getting that wrong. And you can see that some of the kind of highly hyped companies at the moment, for example, Neuralink with Elon Musk, are kind of, on the one hand, jumping ahead to what might be possible in the future, and are using that as a kind of a guiding star, a thing that they're working towards, a kind of big goal that they're trying to achieve, and are focusing quite a lot on what might enable in the future. Can you connect a brain to AI? FOMO, don't be left behind. Don't be the only people who aren't directly connected to AI. I think the kind of flip side of that you're going to get is people obviously worrying about, well, if you're connecting the brain to AI, what does that mean about the kind of safety and the privacy of your thoughts and of that data and where it's going? I think we're a long way off that. And I think the headlines often overblow things
Okay.
a little.
So do you think a company like Neuralink is good for the industry, bringing a lot of attention towards it, or bad for the industry, given that, a lot of it is, by the sounds of it, overhyped?
I think on balance it's good for the industry, and I also think there's a big difference between the hype and the headlines and the kind of the snapshots, the one sentences that Elon Musk might share on Twitter or on X, versus what the really talented scientists and engineers at the company are actually working on. They're working on some really cool tech that might really make a difference to some patients' lives in the much shorter term than that kind of long-term vision that Elon Musk likes to talk about. So I think both from a kind of technological and patient standpoint of what they're working towards, but also from an industry perspective, I don't see it as a bad thing at all. I think one of the things that Neuralink has achieved is getting it more, making more people aware of neurotechnology as an industry, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's a really exciting, really interesting space, and it's still very much in growth mode. Not that many people know about this space, know about the devices that are already out there in the neurotech space. So I think the extra attention it brings to it is a good thing. There's been a lot more interest from VCs in the space since Elon Musk has so publicly put so much money into his company. Again, I don't think that's a bad thing. And sure, you need to be a little bit aware of some of the side effects of that publicity, but I don't see that as a major problem.
Okay. So what are the areas of BCI and brain chip implants that you see as the most impactful in the short term and the near term? Where do you think BCIs can have the biggest impact?
Where do I think BCIs can have the biggest impact? So I think it's worth differentiating. Lots of people have different definitions of BCIs. So if we take BCIs to just be any interface with the brain, then I think some of the biggest impact that's going to be had soon is on the therapy side. So I'm very interested in. There's a big trial going on at the moment by Abbott on using deep brain stimulation for depression. There have been many smaller studies in the past which have had really, really good kind of like 1 to 10 person stories in terms of people having a really big personal impact on them, but there's not yet been a successful large scale trial showing that this is likely to work across a whole population. So I think depression is just it's such a widespread condition that is kind of crying out for more options for treatment, that I think neuromodulation is going to be a really, really valuable addition to that toolkit. I think another area that BCIs are starting to be applied to, which I'm watching with a lot of personal interest, is around stroke and stroke rehab. So I got a bit of a personal story there in that my father had a couple of strokes a few years ago and was very impacted by those. And with the exception of the kind of short-term clot-busting drugs that if you get them into somebody quickly enough, they might help. Other than that, there's really very little that you can offer a stroke patient after that stroke. You can do physical therapy, which might help to recover some of that kind of motion in some cases, but it's quite limited. Certainly for my father, it was he tried, but he didn't have the energy to really fully engage with it, and there was just it was almost like there was too far to go in terms of redeveloping that kind of that muscle strength, as well as the connection and the ability to control those muscles. But there's been some really interesting kind of, again, research and very small studies helping to rebuild some of those connections, helping to using BCIs to improve that rehab process. It's still going to require hard work from the individuals, but if you can reduce, it's almost like reducing that barrier to that improvement that you might be able to see. And stroke, again, it impacts such a large number of people, and there's just not very much that can be done at the moment in that space. So I think that's another really interesting area. And I guess in terms of BCIs, I said there's the therapeutic side, and then there's also the sensing side. So a lot of what a lot of people mean by BCIs is really collecting data from the brain and providing that data to a computer. So that can be around helping somebody to communicate. It can be, so you might have people who are suffering from things like ALS or stroke, actually, who maybe struggle to talk. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not forming the words in their head. It just means that they can't get those words out through their mouth. So using just sensing BCIs, so no stimulation applied, just kind of getting that data, getting those neural signals from the brain in order to be able to communicate, and to be able to communicate much faster than you can do with something like eye tracking. So Hawking was a great example that of both what's possible in a good way, but also how cumbersome it can be for the individual. You couldn't have a real-time conversation. You had to provide questions to him days in advance so that he could formulate them and have that response ready, because the eye tracking takes so long to form full sentences. We're now at the point where people can communicate through a BCI at a similar speed to how you would be able to write or to type. So I think that's already starting to have a huge impact on a few people's lives. It's not yet, it's not widespread, but in terms of kind of impact on individuals, that's already having a really big impact.
Another quick interruption to tell you about our sponsors, KUKA. KUKA is a global leader in robotics with over 25 years of experience partnering with medtech companies on their journey to market. Their reputation is built on robust technology, reliability, and long-term collaboration. More than a supplier, KUKA provides trusted support throughout the product lifecycle, from development to integration and beyond. For companies exploring robotic solutions, the KUKA LBR Med offers a ready-to-integrate, state-of-the-art option that meets the highest medical standards, without the need to build from scratch. If you want to find out more, then head to the show notes and follow the link to KUKA's website.
So what's the biggest barriers to getting these technologies widespread? So you've talked about a really impactful one there, but it's only in a few people so far. What's holding it back from kind of getting way further out into market?
So I would say two things. One is about things that have already been approved and have reimbursement. One of the big barriers is just having the clinicians available, both to tell people that these technologies exist. Because you have pharmaceuticals as an alternative, take spinal cord stimulation as an example. Yes, of course, you're going to be going to the drugs first to see if those work. If they don't work so well, you probably go to a second drug. If that still doesn't work, then you start thinking about alternatives. And then you're down to, well, for your particular clinician, your GP, your pain specialist, what do they know about? Who are they going to refer you to? What paths are they familiar with? What have they seen themselves that has worked for patients in the past? And then really critically, actually, the number of surgeons who are trained to do these procedures. Some of these are very specialist procedures. Some of them you have very small electrodes that need to be wrapped around a nerve or inserted in parts of the nervous system where you need to be very highly trained in that specific process to be able to do that. And rolling out that training is not easy. Fitting that into somebody's workflow, making it work for them as part of their healthcare practice, that's quite a challenging thing to do. So I think just scaling out kind of almost rolling out the therapy and the reimbursement that already exists is one challenge. The second thing I think that's holding us back at the moment for a lot of these therapies is how much effort has to go into making it work for the individual patient. So there are some therapies where actually the physiology of the body is similar enough in enough people that you can place that implant and you can be confident it's being placed in the right place, and then you can decide later exactly how much electrical current are you putting in, how are you going to titrate that therapy. But particularly in the brain, and particularly in complex conditions like depression, every patient is not the same. So how do you decide where exactly to place those contacts? And that's something that when you're running an academic study, you can do 5 MRI scans beforehand. You can kind of figure out, okay, in this person, this brain network seems to be impacted. This one seems to be more or less active compared to controls, or worse on a day when they've got more severe symptoms compared to a good day. And you can go, okay, that means that I think I want to put these contacts in these places, and that we've seen some kind of studies that have been, like I said, really, really impactful to the individuals, but not scalable. You're not going to be able to do that for the numbers of patients that you want to be able to treat. Thinking of deep brain stimulation as an example, that is the absolute kind of most common application for it is for Parkinson's. So you have these deep brain stimulation electrodes, these leads, which get placed into usually the subthalamic nucleus, which is a deep part of the brain. But it's always the same small part of the brain. So you can see on any kind of an anatomical scan where that is in a given person. One of the big challenges is making sure that when you're implanting the device, you're avoiding the blood vessels. So it's really around how do you get there safely. You're not super worried about how to get there. You know how you're going to get there. You just need to make sure that you're going in from the right place and you're not going to cause any damage. When you're talking about depression, which is a kind of network challenge, figuring out for a given person where are you going to have the kind of biggest chance of an impact is a real question. And epilepsy is another example of where actually everybody has there are different types of epilepsy, and if you have focal epilepsy, those the epileptic seizures can start from different locations. So before having a kind of long-term whether it's a surgery or an implant of a neurostimulator, you need to work out for that individual where is their seizure coming from, which form of treatment is most applicable to them. That might mean that you're running a long study, a kind of somebody might have various electrodes connected to them over a week, 2 weeks in order to get that information. For epilepsy, they've kind of managed to find a clinical path that enables that. But I think that's going to be super challenging for other indications to be able to do that. So again, I think one of the challenges that companies like Abbott have come up against for trying to do this for depression is, can you find one target that works for most people? Even if it's not a perfect target, because that way at least you'll be able to fit into a clinical workflow, and there'll be a chance of people being able, clinicians being able to do this somewhat routinely, and for patients to be able to actually access those benefits. So I think it's kind of a double-edged sword in that neuromodulation, you can be super specific, you can be super targeted, you can be super personalized as well. One of the really awesome things about neuromodulation is that you can receive data as well as sending data. You can sense the electrical activity as well as impacting the electrical activity, and that data can be used to then update and modify the therapy that you're delivering. That's fantastic. It opens the door to much more effective treatment and reducing the side effects. But it also makes it complicated. It also means you have a lot of options for each patient, and that makes it difficult to roll out, particularly when it's a new device, a new therapy, a new modality, something that the clinicians are not super familiar with yet.
Awesome. So going to move it on to a couple of fun questions now. So one of the ones is, are there any neurotech myths that you'd like to bust?
The fact that you only use like 10% of your brain?
Okay, go on.
I don't know where this came from originally, but there was a story that there's so much of your brain that you never use, that you're only ever using, like in your whole life, you use 5%, 10%, 20% of your brain. And I guess the thinking behind this is you have so much more that you could achieve that you're not using, that you're not tapping into. I think you use like pretty much all your brain, and there's a bit of a use it or lose it thing in the brain, that actually if you're not using a connection, if you're not using parts of the brain, they will be repurposed and be applied to things that you are using. So coming back to this topic of plasticity and flexibility, the brain has developed to be as efficient as possible. So if you're trying to learn a new skill, if you're adapting to a new environment, things will be changing in your brain to help you to adapt to that. If you no longer need certain skills, then some of those will reduce over time. Not necessarily to nothing. Like if you've learned to ride a bike, chances are you come back decades later and you can still ride a bike, but it won't feel as natural as it would have done beforehand, right? So the brain is constantly adapting, changing. This idea that you don't use the majority of your brain, it's just not true.
Cool. Are there any lines that neurotech shouldn't cross?
What kind of things are you thinking of?
Mind reading or mind control or anything. Take it however you want.
I think the evolution of the space is going to be quite gradual. I think there probably will be lines, but I think they're going to be super blurry. And I think any time that you are developing a new capability, particularly any time you're first trying that in a preclinical or a clinical trial, I think you just need to stop and think of what the potential side effects or future impacts of that could be. I don't think there's a clear line. I don't think, some people might say, brain, reading somebody's thoughts. But some people are already using BCIs to communicate as like the fastest, easiest way of communicating. Is that reading your thoughts? Well, yes and no. It's reading a very, very specific type of thought from a very specific part of the brain after a lot of training. It's not something that's happening by accident. It's something that somebody is having to be very consciously learning how to do, both them learning how to use this device and a certain amount of training for the device to be able to learn how to interpret the signals that they're receiving. So yes, you could say that is reading somebody's mind, that is getting information from mind reading, but that's very different to what people will interpret and think of as could you read somebody's internal monologue or read somebody's intentions before they've even verbalized it. I think we're way, like how likely is that to happen? We're definitely not anywhere kind of near doing that in a way that I think people should be worried about. I think just good practice of ethics of making sure that the people who are trialing or using these devices are fully informed about what it can do, what it might be able to do, what it might be able to do in future, so that people can make their own informed decisions. I think is really important. Other things people worry about is kind of increasing inequality between the people who do or don't have access to some of these devices. I think we've already got that problem. I think the healthcare systems, both across the world, but also in any given country, it's an unfortunate reality that everyone does not have equal access to therapies at the moment. Yes, that might get worse. I think that's a societal problem that I would love for us to address. I don't think that's a reason to not try to progress what we can do with technology and with therapies and to help people. I think, yes, I would love to help everybody with a certain type of disease, but if I can only access half of them, I still think that's better than accessing none of them. So I think it's I don't think it's clear cut, and there's not one clear line that I think I can point to.
Okay. And are there any particularly moving patient stories that you've encountered or seen any patient impacts where it's really taken you back?
Yeah, I can think of definitely. So people with paralysis, whether it's through conditions like ALS or whether it's through spinal cord injury. So people who are stuck in wheelchairs, who can't walk, who are able to see significant improvements in that. So there are companies like Onward who are helping people actually be able to walk again. There are other companies who are using exoskeletons or helping people to control their wheelchairs in a much more intuitive way. So I think those are having big impacts. And one of the things I found particularly exciting in that space is that there have been studies where people who have been paralyzed for a very, very long time with no changes, no improvements, even 10 years, 15 years later, starting to use some of these devices are starting to see improvements. So they thought they'd tried everything, and then they had the opportunity to take part in a trial, and they've said actually, they've started seeing improvements. Even after all of that time, there have been again stroke patients who haven't been able to use one of their hands, who through kind of neurological training, through physiotherapy that's been augmented by neuromodulation, have started to see some improvements. And of course, it's not back to what it would have been beforehand, but small improvements in these areas can have a huge impact on people's lives.
Awesome. And then where does TTP come in when it comes to helping out neurotech companies? What's your core competencies in neuro? And tell me about how you support neuro companies to build technology.
Yeah, so we help with the device development, so with the hardware and the software to create these medical devices. And we have kind of three pillars of expertise. One is around the science, one is the engineering, and one is the kind of user-centered design. So on the science side, it's about understanding how a proposed therapy or how a device works. And the reason that we find this really, really important is there have been cases where you have a really successful, maybe preclinical trial, and then as you move that into a human study and you adapt and you change your device a bit, and it needs to work for a human, not an animal, it needs to be safe, and you're trying to reduce the side effect profile, you get to the point where you're trying to optimize for all these things at once. And if you lose sight of that core, how does this work? What are we trying to achieve, and what's the mechanism of action? There have been cases where, sure, they've reduced the side effects to minimal, but the therapy no longer works. The benefit is gone. So one of the things that we do is keeping that in mind the whole way through. So how does the science work? How far can you optimize that at a fairly early stage? And keep that in mind while you're going through that engineering process, so that the final device works as well as it possibly can. On the engineering side, that's really around a kind of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary teams working on these complex, often small devices. So that's about kind of reliable design, building something that you can be confident will work. And you're talking about implants here, so they need to be biocompatible. They need to pass all of the V&V. There's a lot of things that are kind of hygiene factors, but super important hygiene factors without which you're not going to have a product. So things that kind of just need to be done well, need to be done to a high quality. And then on that third pillar, the user-centered design. I think this is something that's becoming increasingly important in the neurotech space, and it's just around not just having a device that works, but having a device that will actually be used in the real world, that is setting you up for success. So sometimes that's around improving the implantation process. So can you make some small changes to either the device or even the surgical tools that you're using? How can you make this procedure faster, less risky, easier for surgeons? How can you reduce that level of training that's required? How can you improve access? If a general surgeon can implant this, if you can do it as an outpatient procedure rather than an inpatient procedure, that reduces the risks to the patient. It reduces the costs of the device. It opens access to more people. But also, I think there's two classes of users. There's the clinicians, the surgeons, and then there's the end users, the patients themselves. And what can you do to make their experience as smooth as possible, particularly if they need to interface with this device in the long term? So some therapies are fit and forget. You put it in place, you recover from the surgery, the doctor turns it on, and you can kind of just leave it alone and forget about it, live your life. But there are other devices where actually it's really helpful to be able to change the stimulation settings every day. How active are you feeling? How bad is your pain today? How bad is your tremor? Do you want a bit more stimulation or a bit less? In which case, thinking about how are they going to be able to input that. I talked earlier about using your smartphone. Particularly for our generation, that's kind of the vision for, in 20 years' time. Yes, to have it on your smartphone, same as everything else. Your smartphone's always in your pocket. You've always got that with you. That's not where we're at the moment for many reasons. Partly that's around cybersecurity. Partly it's also around actually, you're talking about Parkinson's patients. That's not usually our generation. That's not the people who have a smartphone in their pocket and who want to be using a touch screen while they've got a tremor. So you really have to think about, for your user group, what do they want? What's going to work for them? How simple can you make it? The more simple it is, the more likely it is they're actually going to be able to engage with it. And another part of, we talked earlier about miniaturization of devices. One of the ways that you can often achieve that miniaturization is by moving from a kind of large battery to a small battery, and those small batteries are often rechargeable batteries. So that means that you need to recharge your medical device. Depending on the device, that might be once a day, it might be once a month, it might be once a year. But you need to know that you need to recharge it. You need to figure out how to fit that into your daily life or your regular life. And you need to kind of know that you've done that. It's not like you can kind of plug yourself into a wall socket with a USB-C, right? So designing for ease of use of the patients and kind of intuitive use for the patients as well as the clinicians is absolutely key. And that's something that certainly that I personally have always really enjoyed being at that interface of. How do you know that the thing that you're spending years on that journey of building, of getting kind of qualified, of testing, of getting out into the market, how do you make sure right at the front of that development that the thing that you're going to be building is the right thing, and that it's actually going to work well, to have an impact, and to be easy to use, and to have that route to scaling out, and that it's going to be the kind of the best product, the best usability that it can possibly be.
Awesome. So thank you very much for that. That was such a fun conversation. Is there anything you'd like the audience to remember about the neurotech space or the work at TTP? Any closing thoughts at all?
I think the neurotech space is so exciting because there's so much that can be done with it. It's such a relatively new way of interacting with the nervous system, with the body, and there's so much potential here for so many indications that have not been served well enough by the existing therapies that are out there. And in terms of TTP, we're really here to help that happen. We're really motivated by that end patient impact, by helping companies develop these really successful products and get those out on the market. So yeah, really excited to be working in this space, and really looking forward to the next few years and the future developments here.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining me, Hannah.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you so much for joining me on the Crux of MedTech podcast. If you're not already doing so, please go ahead and subscribe on YouTube or follow the podcast on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Crux. Crux is a medtech search firm which places pioneers in transformative roles to help us live longer, healthier lives. We do 3 things for companies. We help hire world-class executive talent. We help companies raise investment from Series A to Series C and execute upon M&A. And we also are building a community of medtech leaders to facilitate peer-to-peer learning and accelerate the companies to help them go faster. If you're interested in any of those 3 things, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or follow the link in the show notes to find out more. Thank you.